Hello, everybody. Welcome to my couch. We are reading chapter 6 of Brian's Winter. Remember when we left off with chapter 5? He had just made a new friend, and he now has a pet skunk. All right, chapter 6. In the morning, he pushed the door to the side gingerly, looking both ways. He didn't see the skunk, and he pushed the door all the way open and went outside. Still, no skunk. Before heading back for the trench he had dug for a toilet, he pulled the door back over the opening. No sense taking chances, and then trotted off into the woods. When he came back, he looked all around the area and still couldn't see the skunk, and he shrugged. It must have moved on. He kindled an outside fire using coals from the shelter fire and soon had a small cooking fire going. The cold lasted longer now into the morning, and the ice had moved further out into the lake, almost 40 feet from shore all around. The rabbit skin vest and the fire felt especially good. He took the last of the jellied meat in the pot, added a piece of venison, and put it on the side of the fire to cook while he took stock of his situation. The shelter was done, or as done as he could get it, and almost airtight, and warm when he had a fire going inside. He had 9 arrows finished, which seemed like a lot. How many times would he have to defend himself? Besides, even if he used all the arrows, he could get more tips from the arrow stone, and the wood shafts would be there in winter as well. Winter. The word stopped him. He knew nothing about it. At home in upstate New York, there was snow, sometimes a lot of it, and cold at times. Cold enough to make his ears sting. But he could get inside, and he had good warm clothes. Here he suspected the winter would be a lot worse, but he didn't know how much worse or how to prepare for it. Just then the meat was done, and at exactly that moment, as he pulled the pot off the fire, the skunk came waddling around the end of the rock, stopped 4 feet away, and raised its tail. "What?" Brian winced, waiting, but the skunk did not spray. And Brian took a piece of meat from the pot and threw it on the ground next to it. The skunk lowered its tail, smelled the meat, and when it proved too hot to eat, it backed away and raised its tail again. "Listen, you little robber. I'm sorry if it's too hot. You'll just have to wait until it cools." The skunk kept its tail up, but lowered it a bit, and seemed to understand. And in a moment, when the meat cooled, it picked up the chunk and disappeared with it around the corner of the large rock that was the back wall of Brian's shelter. "Where are you going?" Brian stood up and followed at a distance, moving slowly. And when he came around the rock, the skunk was gone, disappeared completely. But Brian walked around the end back again and was on his second loop when he saw some grass wiggling at the edge where the rock met the ground. The grass here was thick and about a foot tall and hid the dirt from view. Brian moved closer and saw some fresh earth and a hole beneath the rock, and as he watched, he saw black and white fur moving down inside the hole. "You're living here? Ugh. You've moved in on me?" The skunk stopped moving inside for a moment, then started again, and while Brian watched, little spurts of dirt came out of the entrance as the skunk dug back in under the rock. Brian turned away. Wonderful. I've got a roommate with a terminal hygiene problem. Inside of 4 days, a routine was established. The skunk came to the entrance in the morning, flicked its tail in the air, and waited to be fed. Brian fed it, and it went back to its burrow until the next morning. It wasn't exactly friendship, but soon Brian smiled when he saw the skunk. He named it Betty after deciding that it was a female and that it looked like his aunt, who was low and round and waddled the same way. He looked forward to seeing it. After developing the acquaintance with the skunk, Brian had gone back to work on the heavy bow. The arrows were done, but he had yet to string the bow and was stymied on where to get a string long enough until he saw the cord at the end of the sleeping bag. It was braided nylon, 1/8 of an inch thick and close to 6 feet long, enough to go around the bag twice when it was rolled up. The cord was sewn into the end of the bag, but he sharpened the knife on his sharpening rock and used the point to open the stitching enough to free the cord. It proved to be difficult to string the bow. In spite of his scraping and shaping, the limbs were still very stout, and the bow bent only with heavy pressure. He tied the string to one end, then put the tied end in a depression in a rock on the ground, and used his weight to pull down the top end while he tied the cord in place. It hummed when he plucked it, and the strength of the wood seemed to sing in the cord. He took 4 of the arrows and moved to a dirt hummock near the lake shore. He put the arrow in the bow and fitted it to the string, raised the bow, and looked down the shaft at the target and drew the arrow back, or tried to. When it was halfway to his chin, the bow seemed to double in strength, and he was shaking with the exertion by the time he got the feathers all the way back, and the cord seemed to be cutting through his fingers. He released quickly before he had time to aim properly, and saw the arrow crease the top of the hummock, skip onto the lake ice, jump off the ice, and fly across the open water in the middle and land skittering across the ice on the far side of the lake, a good 200 yards. At the same time, the string slapped his arm so hard it seemed to tear the skin off, and the rough front end of the feathers cut the top of his hand as they passed over it. Wow! He could not see the arrow, but he knew where it had gone and would walk around the lake later and retrieve it. Now he had to practice. He changed the angle he was shooting so the arrows wouldn't go across the lake if he missed. When he missed, he thought, smiling, and moved closer to the hummock. It was hard to judge the strength of the pull of the bow. He guessed 50, 60 pounds of pull were required to get the string back to his chin, and every shot hurt his arm and fingers and hand. But it was worth it. The arrows left the bow so fast that he couldn't see them fly, and they hit so hard that 2 of them drove on through the hummock and kept going for 15 or 20 yards and broke the stone tips. He made new tips that night, and while he was making them, he knew he would be hunting bigger game. It was strange how the thought came, or how it just seemed to be there. He had made the bow for protection, had thought only in terms of protection all the while he was making arrows. But somewhere along the way, the knowledge that he would use it to hunt was just there. Maybe it was eating the meat from the doe that had done it. There was so much of it, and it tasted so good, and was easier to deal with than the smaller animals. Whatever the reason, when he aimed at the hummock to practice, he saw the chest of a deer. He shot all that day until his shoulders were sore and he had broken an arrow and 2 more tips by hitting small rocks along the ground. Then at dark he built a fire, cooked some meat, fed Betty, who arrived just as the meat was done, and retired to the shelter to fix arrows. He would hunt big tomorrow, he thought. He would try to get a deer. Okay, and that is the end of chapter 6. A little shorter chapter this time. So answer the questions and be sure to get them to me by Tuesday. Bye.